There is a comforting story modern people tell themselves, that humanity is tough, that civilization is the natural end of intelligence, that progress is a straight line. But the deeper archaeology digs, the more uncomfortable the past becomes, because there were moments, ancient, brutal moments, when the world did not merely threaten a kingdom or a city, but seemed to swing toward erasing the entire human experiment. Not in myth, not as metaphor, as physics, geology, climate, and biology, moving like a single machine with no regard for who we were becoming. Picture an Earth that looks familiar and yet is utterly hostile. The sky dims for years, not hours. Seasons collapse into confusion. Rain stops coming where it always came. Rivers fail. Grasslands turn brittle. Herd animals migrate and vanish. Coastlines change as if the ocean itself has decided to redraw the map. And everywhere, the same quiet arithmetic begins. Calories disappear. Heat disappears. Trust disappears. People move, not because they are curious, but because staying means death. If you could stand in that deep past and watch from a distance, you might notice something even more unsettling: how small the human footprint is. A handful of scattered groups, thin lines of smoke, temporary shelters, voices that do not yet know writing, laws, or gods with fixed names. And then, one shock after another, events so vast they leave scars in rock and ice, while human memory, fragile and oral, struggles to hold the shape of what happened. The most terrifying part is not that catastrophe struck. It's that the evidence suggests catastrophe struck close enough to the edge that the human story might have ended without ceremony. No ruins to mourn, no archives to preserve, just silence and a planet that would have carried on without ever knowing what it had erased. And yet, here we are. So the mystery is not simply what these ancient cataclysms were. The deeper question is how close we came, how close our species came to being reduced to a genetic whisper, and why the record of that closeness is still incomplete, still argued over, still haunting the boundary between what we can prove and what we can only reconstruct. Because if the past contains multiple near extinctions, then survival is not a guarantee. It is a narrow corridor we have walked before, often without understanding how thin the walls were. To understand how close humanity came to disappearing, it is necessary to abandon the familiar timelines of kings, empires, and written history. These events unfolded long before monuments or chronicles existed, in a world where human survival depended entirely on climate stability, animal migration, and fragile ecosystems. For more than 90% of our species' existence, humans lived as small, nomadic groups. There were no cities to absorb shocks, no stored surplus to buffer long disasters, no technology capable of reshaping environments at scale. Population numbers were astonishingly low by modern standards. What today would be considered a minor regional disaster had the potential in deep prehistory to become a species-level threat. During the late Pleistocene epoch, Earth was not a stable planet. It oscillated violently between cold and warm phases. Ice sheets advanced and retreated over thousands of years, altering coastlines, river systems, and habitable land. Sea levels rose and fell by more than 100 meters, repeatedly cutting off migration routes and isolating human groups from one another. Entire regions that had once supported life became uninhabitable within a few generations. Human expansion out of Africa unfolded against this unstable backdrop. As small bands moved into Eurasia, Australia, and eventually the Americas, they encountered unfamiliar climates and unpredictable ecological pressures. Success was never guaranteed. Each migration wave was a gamble against extinction, relying on narrow windows of environmental opportunity. What makes this period especially unsettling is how invisible catastrophe can be in the archaeological record. When populations are sparse, disappearance leaves few traces. A vanished group leaves no ruins, no mass graves, no written lament. Their loss is recorded only indirectly, in sudden gaps, genetic bottlenecks, and shifts in tool traditions that appear and then abruptly stop. Modern science has begun to piece together this hidden history using methods unimaginable even a century ago. Ice cores reveal abrupt temperature drops lasting decades or centuries. Sediment layers record massive volcanic eruptions and global ash falls. Genetic studies show moments when the entire human population may have been reduced to only a few thousand breeding individuals, scattered and vulnerable. This background reframes human history not as a steady ascent, but as a sequence of narrow survivals. Civilization did not emerge because the world was kind, but because, against long odds, it occasionally paused its violence just long enough for recovery. Against this fragile backdrop, certain cataclysms stand out, events so sudden or so severe that they may have pushed humanity closer to extinction than at any other time, before or since. What makes ancient cataclysms so unsettling is not simply their scale, but the uncertainty surrounding their true impact on humanity. The evidence suggests that several global or near-global disasters occurred during periods when human populations were already dangerously small. Yet the exact consequences remain unclear, suspended between what the planet remembers and what humanity forgot. One of the most debated questions is whether these cataclysms caused sudden population collapses or whether they pushed humans into prolonged states of near extinction that lasted for generations. In some periods, genetic data points to extreme bottlenecks, moments when human diversity shrank so drastically that all living people today descend from a remarkably small group of survivors. What is missing is the narrative in between, the lived experience of those collapses. The planet itself provides clues, but never a full confession. Layers of volcanic ash indicate eruptions powerful enough to darken skies across continents. Ice cores record abrupt drops in temperature that would have shattered ecosystems within a human lifetime. Sedimentary evidence suggests massive floods, rapid desertification, and sudden sea level changes. Each of these signals corresponds to a crisis that humans would have been ill-equipped to endure. And yet, archaeology often shows continuity where collapse is expected. Stone tools persist, migration continues, fire use does not disappear. This raises an unsettling possibility that survival did not mean stability, that humans may have endured these cataclysms not as thriving societies, but as scattered remnants, living at the edge of starvation, reproduction barely outpacing death. Another layer of mystery lies in the global nature of some events. Climatic disruptions appear simultaneously across vast regions, suggesting causes far beyond local disasters. Supervolcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, and abrupt shifts in ocean circulation are all candidates. But connecting these planetary events directly to human suffering is extraordinarily difficult when the victims left no written testimony. Complicating matters further is the role of memory. Some researchers argue that echoes of these cataclysms survive in ancient myths, flood stories, tales of fire from the sky, sunless years, and worlds reset by divine force. Others caution against reading geology into legend. The line between collective memory and symbolic storytelling is thin, and crossing it risks turning evidence into narrative convenience. The mystery, then, is not whether catastrophe occurred. The Earth's record is clear on that point. The real question is how close these events came to erasing humanity entirely, and whether the narrow survival we see in the data represents resilience or sheer luck stretched to its limit. If these cataclysms did reduce humanity to the brink, then every chapter of history that followed was built atop an almost empty world. The strongest witnesses to ancient cataclysms are not ruins or artifacts, but the planet itself. Earth preserves its traumas with far greater fidelity than human memory ever could. In ice, rock, ash, and DNA, traces remain of events so extreme that they altered the course of life for thousands of years. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica reveal sudden, dramatic temperature drops occurring within mere decades. These were not slow climatic shifts, but abrupt disruptions, periods when average global temperatures fell sharply and stayed low long enough to devastate plant growth and animal populations. For small, widely dispersed human groups, such changes would have meant immediate crisis, failed foraging cycles, collapsing food chains, and forced migration into unfamiliar territories. Volcanic evidence tells a similarly grim story. Layers of ash found across South Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Africa point to colossal eruptions, capable of injecting vast quantities of sulfur and debris into the atmosphere. One eruption in particular left a global ash signature so thick that it appears in sediment layers thousands of kilometers from its source. Atmospheric modeling suggests years of reduced sunlight and global cooling, conditions that would have severely disrupted ecosystems upon which early humans depended. Genetic studies provide perhaps the most chilling evidence. Modern human DNA shows signs of extreme bottlenecks, moments when genetic diversity plunged to levels consistent with a population numbering in the low thousands, or possibly even fewer. These bottlenecks do not appear once, but multiple times, hinting at repeated brushes with extinction rather than a single near-fatal blow. Archaeological sites from these periods often show signs of stress rather than total abandonment. Toolkits become simpler. Settlement patterns shift rapidly. Long-distance trade disappears. These changes suggest populations under pressure, prioritizing survival over innovation, mobility over permanence. The absence of artistic or symbolic artifacts during certain intervals may reflect not cultural regression, but exhaustion. Perhaps most revealing is what does not appear in the record. There is no evidence of large-scale recovery immediately following these events. Instead, human populations seem to have lingered at low numbers for extended periods, slowly rebuilding diversity and geographic spread. Survival, it seems, was not heroic or dramatic. It was quiet, incremental, and painfully slow. Together, these discoveries paint a picture of humanity not as a dominant force, but as a fragile species repeatedly tested by a volatile planet. Each survival was less a triumph than a narrow escape, leaving behind just enough evidence for modern science to sense the danger, but never enough to fully reconstruct the experience. Within mainstream science, the near collapse of early human populations is not attributed to a single apocalyptic event, but to a convergence of powerful natural forces acting on already vulnerable communities. The most widely accepted explanations focus on large-scale environmental disruptions that unfolded rapidly enough to overwhelm adaptation. One of the leading explanations centers on abrupt climate instability. During the late Pleistocene, Earth's climate system was highly sensitive to shifts in ocean circulation and atmospheric composition. Sudden cooling events, sometimes occurring within a single human lifetime, would have caused cascading ecological failures. Vegetation zones shifted faster than plants and animals could adapt, leaving human foragers trapped between disappearing resources and hostile terrain. Another explanation involves massive volcanic eruptions capable of producing prolonged volcanic winters. Such eruptions would not need to annihilate humans directly. Instead, their power lay in long-term disruption, reduced sunlight, colder temperatures, and weakened monsoon systems. For populations dependent on predictable seasonal cycles, even a few years of climatic chaos could trigger famine, disease, and population collapse. Mainstream researchers also point to the cumulative effect of repeated shocks. A single catastrophe might be survivable. Several occurring within a few thousand years could be devastating. Each disaster would reduce population size, fragment social networks, and erase accumulated knowledge. Recovery would begin, only to be interrupted again before stability could return. Importantly, these explanations avoid portraying humans as passive victims. Evidence suggests that flexibility, dietary diversity, mobility, social cooperation played a critical role in survival. Groups that could shift food sources, move across wide territories, or maintain social bonds over distance were more likely to endure. Survival, in this view, was uneven and selective. Yet, even within these explanations, uncertainty remains. Climate models can describe what happened to the planet, but they struggle to capture human experience at such small population scales. Archaeology can show patterns, but not fear, hunger, or the collapse of trust. Mainstream explanations explain plausibility, not certainty. They tell us how extinction might have been narrowly avoided, but not how close the edge truly was. Alongside mainstream explanations, a range of alternative theories has emerged, not because the evidence demands them, but because the gaps in our understanding leave room for deeper uncertainty. These ideas occupy the space between established science and unanswered questions, And they persist, precisely because the stakes are so high. One such theory proposes that humanity faced a more sudden and severe population collapse than mainstream models suggest. One so extreme that survival bordered on statistical improbability. Advocates of this view point to genetic bottlenecks that appear sharper than expected, implying not gradual decline but near instantaneous reduction. In this scenario, only a handful of scattered groups survived, isolated from one another, unaware that they represented the last threads of an entire species. Another controversial hypothesis focuses on extraterrestrial impacts. While no confirmed asteroid strike aligns perfectly with known human bottlenecks, proponents argue that smaller or fragmented impacts could have caused regional devastation severe enough to cascade globally. Dust clouds, wildfires, and disrupted climate systems might not leave a single obvious crater, but could still push fragile human populations past the brink. There are also theories involving rapid sea level rise and megaflood events, far exceeding traditional models. As ice sheets destabilized, sudden releases of meltwater may have reshaped coastlines in a matter of years rather than centuries. Human groups living along fertile coastal corridors, areas now submerged, would have been disproportionately affected, leaving behind little archaeological trace and creating the illusion of sudden disappearance. Some researchers cautiously explore the possibility that early human survival was aided by cultural or cognitive shifts triggered by catastrophe itself. Extreme stress may have accelerated cooperation, language complexity, or social memory. In this view, disaster did not merely threaten extinction, it reshaped what it meant to be human. This idea remains speculative, difficult to test, and highly debated. What unites these alternative theories is not proof, but unease. Each arises from the same realization that the conventional record may be too thin to fully capture events that unfolded when humanity was small, scattered, and nearly invisible against planetary forces. These theories do not overturn established science. Instead, they underline how incomplete our picture remains, and how much of early human survival may have hinged on factors we can no longer measure. Ancient cataclysms are not relics of a distant, irrelevant past. They matter because they reveal a fundamental truth that modern civilization often forgets. Human survival has always been conditional. The same forces that once nearly erased humanity still exist. The climate system remains capable of abrupt shifts. Supervolcanic systems are dormant, not extinct. Asteroids still pass through Earth's orbital neighborhood. Ocean circulation patterns continue to influence global stability. What has changed is not the planet's volatility, but our assumption that technology alone insulates us from it. These ancient near extinctions also challenge the narrative of human exceptionalism. Survival was not guaranteed by intelligence or ingenuity alone. It depended on timing, geography, and circumstances beyond control. Recognizing this does not diminish humanity. It clarifies our place within a larger natural system, one that does not bend to intention. There is also a deeper psychological dimension. When modern societies face crisis, they often search for historical precedent. Ancient cataclysms remind us that collapse can occur without warning, without villain, and without moral logic. They strip disaster of symbolism and reveal it as process. This perspective is uncomfortable, but necessary. On a scientific level, studying these events sharpens our understanding of risk. By identifying how close humanity came to extinction before, researchers can better estimate thresholds, how much disruption ecosystems can absorb before cascading failure begins. This knowledge informs modern assessments of climate change, food security, and long-term survival planning. Perhaps most importantly, these cataclysms force a reckoning with continuity. Every language spoken today, every culture, every technological system exists only because a small number of humans endured conditions that should have erased them. The modern world is built not on inevitability, but on survival against improbable odds. Understanding that fragility does not weaken the future. It clarifies what must be protected. The history of humanity is often told as a story of ascent, of tools becoming technologies, shelters becoming cities, and survival giving way to dominance. But beneath that familiar arc lies another narrative, quieter and far more unsettling. Again and again, the planet shifted in ways that did not care whether humans were ready. Climate collapsed, skies darkened, ecosystems failed. And during several of these moments, the human story came close to ending, not with drama, but with attrition, one failed season at a time, one small group disappearing without record. What saved humanity was not destiny, nor foresight, nor superiority. It was endurance within narrow margins. A handful of survivors, scattered across landscapes that no longer favored them, carried forward a genetic and cultural thread so thin it almost vanished. Everything that followed, art, science, civilization, rests on that improbable continuation. The unanswered questions remain. How many times did extinction approach? How close did it truly come? And how much of what we call progress exists only because catastrophe paused, briefly, before delivering the final blow? These ancient cataclysms do not offer comfort. They offer perspective. They remind us that survival is never permanent, and that the line between existence and erasure can be far thinner than history suggests. If the past nearly erased us without warning, then the future will not announce its test either. The only certainty is that humanity has walked this edge before, and that remembering how close it was may be the most important lesson the deep past still has to teach.